This is Big Man Tyrone, and you're about to watch the MtG Cabal cast with your hosts, Woad, Thirsty, and Reptar. Sub to us on all your podcast networks at MtG Cabal Cast and YouTube.
All right, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabalcast Part 2 of our episode on what's relevant for old school EDH staples, stuff like that. So today, last portion, we're going to get into staple. What does it mean? How do we define it? What is like a hardline staple? What's more of a softline staple? Just to kind of get into the minutia and more into the weeds on what that word means, more or less. Basically, it depends what your definition of the word is.
Yes.
In magic form.
Yep. Blue dress. But we're going to, looking at old school and reserveless is kind of difficult because there's not a lot of middle ground. You have some, outstanding cards like Grim Monolith, and then some clunkers like Skeletal Ship or Skeleton Ship, whatever that is, right? And so it's very polarizing. But what I try and do for old school and reserveless stuff is very similar to what I like to do when I'm looking at standard cards or cards from supplemental sets first. And I look for, immediately impactful cards or cards that are going to become impactful based on information we have. So some quick examples of cards that were immediately impactful just by reading: Paradox Engine, Panharmonicon, Sunbird's Invocation. They all read to be immediately impactful, and they were. And then cards that became impactful, something recently with Ikoria and the keyword tokens, is Skullbriar, the Walking Elemental, because Skullbriar keeps tokens when it leaves. I believe the Ozolith just vacuums up +1/+1 tokens, otherwise you could kind of look at that. But that's kind of where I look overall, and to me, regardless of whether it's old school or reserveless or something brand new, this kind of impact represents to me some of the best specs, as they'll see organic demand, which means a true price. And a lot of these might not be quick flips. Some of them might be like Skullbriar, you could buy into and then move out 2 weeks later. So my exit strategy on these is a mid to longer hold, and it allows me to let my specs mature on their own and focus on other things in Magic. It's less micromanagement of my specs overall because these are immediately impactful cards. I don't have to worry.
For me, I look a lot more, I think I look long-term, such as Sarkhan's Unsealing. Is it something that is immediately impactful? No, it should be.
Yep.
Because it has a very powerful, impactful effect. Another example was, and you picked this a couple weeks ago, Vicious Shadows from Shards of Alara. It's something that has a very impactful effect on a board state. And for me, I tend to look a lot more at EDH staples, and with much less regard for the reserve list.
Yep.
Because to me, the reserve list is funny money. You throw enough shit at the wall, it's gonna stick. But Emberwild Caliph, that card's garbage, but it's like $4 now because somebody decided to mess around with the reserve list. Whatever. The thing is, with EDH staples, I play a lot more CEDH, so for me, it's really easy to do that. For casual EDH, is it big and dumb and does something Timmy-like? Great, that's it. That's what I'm going for.
Yep.
And that's what I tend to look for. I think the interesting thing that comes in is, does a card need eyes? And basically by that we mean, how much exposure away from being worth money is this card?
Mm-hmm.
I tend to look, and I have two ways that I do this. Cards that are clearly impactful when we get interaction with them.
Okay.
I always talk about, this card's one card away from being busted in half.
Yeah.
So I kind of look for those cards. Shadow of the Grave was one that I picked, I think, in year one. That was a great example of this. Basically, if all your cards you discarded, return them to your hand. That card's really one card away from being busted. And that's something that I would target as a pick here.
Mm-hmm.
And is it something that is, the other one is it a color staple? By which I mean, does it do something that's clearly within the overarching design strategy of Wizards? Is it a blue card that does literally anything?
That is
okay.
Yeah.
It's within the design strategy, sure. What the Lityara card I picked that doubles tokens because blue does that now?
Why not? Yeah.
Or, Parallel Lives, which is, or was, a clearly green effect, or Branching Evolution, which is a clearly green effect. And that's a much more low-level look at things in terms of the casual EDH marketplace when I target.
Yep.
But that's, for me, that's what I look for when it's, does it need eyes? Is it one card away, or is it something that has casual exposure that just needs to see some movement in inventory, or maybe have a card printed but already has somewhat of a price history?
Yeah. I just thinking about this, like, for me, needs eyes is less about how close it is to going off and more that it's already relevant and really just needs to show up somewhere. So I define that as a spec. It's, just because a card needs a little bit of a push in terms of visibility doesn't make it a bad spec. There's a lot of stuff that's like just below the waterline that is extremely good and extremely playable. It just needs a content creator to kind of push it forward. And there's examples of this all over the place. Exsanguinate is a really good example. It showed up on Star City Versus a couple of times and then just took right off. People just weren't playing it. They weren't paying attention to it for a while. And the moment it hit a content creator, it blew up, similar to the Saffron Olive effect. And,
Any of the Pirate Stompy stuff.
Yep. Commander content is coming out, all the time, and eventually everything will get a look. Sometimes it takes multiple looks, but everything will get a look. And for me, that's what eyes really, really means. A good example of a card that needed visibility that we were able to get out ahead of, Paradox Haze. So that was a pick I made after the release of the double Upkeep Sphinx, but before it got its Commander content look, before the EDH Rec feedback loop hit. We hit in that butter zone with the pick where we were able to get out ahead because once it got eyes, it took off. Similarly with Thousand Year Storm, we picked that one a couple of years ago and we got out ahead of the Spellslinger demand and we were able to fall backwards into Magecraft this last set, right? So these were cards that just needed a little bit more of that push. Something that needs eyes overall and is just below the waterline from the reserve list is something like Second Chance. That card was really good and it was one card away from being busted, and eventually we got that in Hall of Heliod's Generosity. So that kind of speaks to your point where that card was ready to go. It's a reserveless card. You could sit on infinite if you wanted to, because eventually at some point something's going to be able to recur enchantments ad nauseum, and eventually we got it. So that represents this like high level reserveless card that you could look and say, hey, I want this instead of Wall of Kelp, or whatever bits and bobs you have.
And I think another interesting thing is when you look at cards like this, prime example, and this is one I mention a lot, is Collected Company.
Yep.
This is a card that it's not reserveless, but it's definitely a staple, and it's a staple that improves, again, because of the overarching design strategy that Wizards of the Coast has, that we want to make increasingly aggressively costed dudes.
Yep.
And as long as they do that, that card stands to gain value long-term as well. Is it a reprint risk? Sure, but everything not reserve list is.
Yep.
So it's about looking at that and seeing the ebbs and flows and kind of getting ahead of that.
Yeah. I do want to go back and touch on, like, you play more competitively EDH. I'm more kitchen table focused in that regard. So for me, CEDH isn't really that much of a draw when I'm looking at specs. I know some of the things I look at, some of the things I target can overlap, but I haven't really found a robust and regular resource like EDH Rec has been for the casual scene. So for me, I don't really kind of cater my specs towards CEDH, and anything that overlaps has just kind of become a happy accident. I didn't read into this. The Gladiator format was just announced today. We have Oathbreaker that is making a resurgence a little bit, and eventually I assume somebody will necro Tiny Leaders, and at that point we're going to get a lot of this kind of cross-format, demand, although it's all just spin-offs of the same format.
Yeah. Middle school, pre-modern, stuff like that.
Yeah, and as far as targeting constructed formats for reserveless stuff goes, it really is just looking at historics for me. And needing eyes now for a reserveless card means finding what was good back then and what isn't being played now and kind of target that. Masticore is a good example of that. That card ran formats in standard and extended. It didn't see a lot of play in middle school, but it's a reserveless card, so it commands a premium. eventually I think it took off, and if it hasn't, it will, because if more people move in, then it's going to kind of pick up where it left off in those formats, you know.
And I think that's the important thing when you're looking at old school, especially, is, you know, and we touched on this last episode, historics are super important there.
Yep.
And I think that, you know, to bridge that to a more modern thing, looking for historic analogs is also very important when looking at this stuff. You know, last week I picked Pendrell Mists, and I said in my reasoning for it, you know, aside from whatever price stuff, this is basically the only other printing of Tabernacle that we will ever get.
Yeah.
And it's reserved list. But there's a historical analog for Tabernacle being really good and very impactful in EDH games.
Yeah.
Well, Pendrell Mist could be that.
There you go. Yeah, and trying to apply a lot of this to old school is kind of a unique thought experiment, because the reason old school is really popular and plays a lot differently than Magic did back then is because a lot of the deck building paradigms and the way we understand the game now didn't exist back then. So it's about applying current knowledge to these micro formats. And a lot of what you're looking at and what you could expect to kind of evolve out of the data that we had about those formats isn't really going to come to fruition, because things have changed so much. Yeah, there's still Stompy decks and there's still Zoo decks, and they resemble what used to be back then, because the efficiency of 1/1s for 1 didn't really change. Script Sprites is still going to be and Curdy premier Zoo cards. You know, the Orc Goblin like mono red Stompy deck, that's basically going to play the same. But the deck, the mono black control deck, things like that, they're being redesigned from the ground up. And so a lot of what you saw then isn't what you see now. And so trying to cast this back and look at old school is, like I said, a very unique thought experiment. But there is still room to operate between old school cards and the reserve list, because people do crazy things in that format to get ahead where they can, based on what they're seeing.
And I think it's also worth noting that on some of this stuff, there is a point where you need to recognize that something has reached its ceiling. Mm-hmm. So when targeting stuff, I also want to look at, you know, is there room for growth here? Is there room for more playability? Is there a chance that this card gets something better? Second chance, for example. Is there a chance we ever get something that does Hall of Heliod's Generosity better than Hall of Heliod's Generosity? Probably not. I don't think that ever happens.
Yeah.
You know, we already have Replenish. We already have Open the Vaults.
Yeah, I think Open the Vaults gets enchantments back. Yep.
Like, we have effects like that. And we're not getting something similar to or better than Hall unless it's something like, I don't know, a Planeswalker that bounces an enchantment back to play. But do you think they're going to do that? And is it worth holding on to something like Second Chance that has exploded this way? And that's, you know, when you talked about a mid to long-term hold, I am also much more of a mid to long-term hold on these. But I'm also very much, you know, did I get my margins? And is there a chance my margins improve much from here?
Yeah. I think, actually, if I remember correctly, when I picked Spoils of the Vault for the modern Adnaz deck, this is, you know, before they did my boy dirty, and I talked about the options set forth for speccing on that deck, and the reason for Spoils of the Vault wasn't just because it was the crux of that deck, but it had a much higher ceiling than something like Angel's Grace or Phyrexian Unlife, which were already expensive cards. Your percentage growth on Spoils, a 4 of staple on that deck, was going to be larger than either of those two cards. So the floor being lower, you can buy more copies, get out at a higher percentage, and make more profit overall if you're willing to take the time to do so.
And I think that that's something that is kind of an individual basis as far as, are you comfortable going for the low floor, high ceiling, or do you want the sure thing?
Yep.
And how deep do you want to go on those? I tend to go, you know, I am a reserveless slumlord, and I will scream that into the skies. I still have Grim Feast that I paid less than $1 for that I keep finding. I have, I don't know how many Purgatories, Emberwild Caliphs, all this just absolute gutter trash. But that's what I like, is the low floor, high ceiling.
Yep.
That said, people have definitely made more money than me flipping Juzums than I have off that Slumlord stuff for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
So, you know, take it where it suits you, where you're more comfortable, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the last big point we wanted to talk about, and we're kind of getting there, is when we look at these specs, can they stand on their own for the longer term, you know, for the long haul? And for me, this is about organic demand, playability, and power level. So going back to the first point, that I made of immediately or recently impactful, those cards, can they stand on their own? And the Venn diagram for this stuff isn't quite a circle. It seems like it, but it isn't. But you look at things like Teferi's Veil, which spiked recently because it phases your creatures out in combat, so they ETB and retrigger. It's recently impactful, but it cannot stand on its own and requires a specific strategy to kind of post it up. It's similar to the color changing effects that we just saw coming out of Commander Legends or somewhere out there. Like, I forgot exactly what is it commander you play where you just want to shift colors. But without that commander, if anything happens to that deck, then all of these specs fold in the long term. So I look at cards that are broadly powerful. So if something were to happen, a banning, etc., demand would remain. Subnote: I never expected Paradox Engine to get banned.
Yeah, fair. Look, there were clearly cards that needed to be banned over Paradox Engine that it took months later, but Arkham's Astrolabe existed for 2 years too long for Legacy to thrive. Yep. Anyways, I digress.
So for me, that's what I'm looking for when I'm looking for a longer term spec. Can it stand on its own? That's how I look at these specs and how I want to define them. Flash in the pan stuff is fine if you're going to churn it quickly, but that's not my style.
Yeah.
So.
And I think for me, it's something that, is it impactful on its own, or does it fit into a strategy? Mm-hmm. Prime example, I picked foil Jun-2 Stakes last year.
Yep.
Another one that did pretty well, and now I think it's buy listing for $15, and I bought all my copies for less than $5. It's a Stacks card. Stacks as an archetype isn't going anywhere in EDH.
Yep.
So I'm comfortable picking up that card. Sarkhan's Unsealing goes with big dumb red stuff. That's an archetype that isn't going anywhere in EDH. Those are things I'm comfortable picking in on because they're impactful and they're not dependent on one particular card. Ravager, Mox Opal. Ravager could not have existed in Modern without Mox Opal, which paid for Urza's sins. And when Opal went, all of a sudden Ravager started tanking in value because he really only played in Legacy and Vintage now. Yep. And that's an example of something I would stay away from. Obviously, that's a constructed format, different story. But
it's still a worthwhile theory to apply, though.
Yeah, no, for sure. Are foil Protean Hulks worth money now? Yeah, absolutely. But if Flash gets banned, oh wait.
Yeah, guess
what?
We were talking about Mist Hollow Griffin in Discord because Jarvis Yu was talking about Allure decks. Food Chain decks in Legacy last week. And if you're going to spec on that deck, there's a lot of opportunity. But if you're specking on any of the combo pieces and something happens to Food Chain, then the floor is cut out from underneath you because those combo pieces don't work anywhere else.
Yeah. And it's something to pay attention to because, and obviously Flash is banned, so Protean Hulk, whatever.
Yep.
But, those are the types of things that you need to pay attention to. Is this actually directly dependent on something else? Or is this just good on its own? And that's something to pay attention to. A great example, and this was a debate that was had ad nauseum when speaking about EDH. Was it Recurring Nightmare or was it Kokosho?
Yes.
Which one was it?
Because that was
they were
when
both banned for a while, and now Kokosho's off. Sorry, go ahead.
Did you say that was when banned as a commander was a thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's one of those can clearly exist in the format just fine without the other.
Yeah.
So if you banked on all of one that was dependent on the other card, well, guess what? Also, one of those was much better because reserve list. Anyways.
Yeah,
But I think that's something that merits as well, and that's something that comes from format knowledge. Game knowledge and just understanding how interactions work, which if you're lacking, just ask the community. Long term, do you think this card is good? Does this card need another card to exist in the format?
Yep.
I think that's important.
Yeah, exactly. And just talking through this, you can kind of see why for me the still needs one more card thing doesn't really work out unless it's a reserveless card like I mentioned with Second Chance. I'm not leery of cards that need more to function because I think they're bad specs up front. It's because I don't think that in the long-term aspect they're going to have the same demand that cards that don't require more to prop them up are
That's
worth.
Fair.
So that's part of my strategy overall, and that's why when I talk through our my specs for the cast, I want to go through as many options as possible when it comes to deck building archetypes, and I like casting that wide net for things that kind of fold into more than one archetype to ensure that we're covered if something does happen to one. There is a fallback, a safety net, and a lot of this also speaks to how I like to handle my specs, which is just set it and forget it, and I check in every couple weeks or a couple months as needed, or unless I see something just spikes ridiculously, and then I shove it out the door.
Sure.
I'm not looking for that quick flip. So my ethos is going to be different than somebody else's when they're somebody who makes these quick moves.
I think that's also one of the differences is that when you take a look at those two strategies, because I'm fine with the one card away, and you prefer not to, there is a much more real possibility that my cards are never worth money when I spec on them, and I'm comfortable with that because I'm gambling on the upside.
Yep.
And that's something that you need to be okay with before you decide this is something you want to go with, because you may be sitting on these cards forever. You may eventually reach the point where you're sitting on like 400 Sarkhan's Unsealings, and you're like, well, I guess, I'm just the Sarkhan's Unsealing guy from here on out. Cool. Yeah. I don't want to be the Seance guy. I don't want to be that guy, because then Wizards memes you and reprints it in a Masters set and you're screwed.
Yeah.
But that's something that you have to be comfortable with, because it is a reality of something that can happen.
Yes. Yeah.
And, make sure when you set out on the Slumlord path that you're okay with it. Because while, yes, I trust that Wizards will do everything it can to screw up card design, I don't think that necessarily it happens with every card I pick.
Yeah.
So
I understood and agreed. And I think a lot of this, we keep talking about, you got to pick your strategy and figure out what do you like to do, what works best for you and how you want to operate. And there really is like no wrong answer to how you want to operate and run your your gambit. Spend your money as you see fit. So I think overall a lot of this is going to be to flavor, and so we just wanted to give you this kind of starting point. This is where we are, this is what works for us. We take this kind of vendor perspective because this is what we're used to. You don't just buy to flip immediately, you buy to meet demand. That's our world is purely supply and demand. It's to not just buy to sell immediately into FOMO. We want to serve a larger customer base, have a larger inventory for the companies we work for, and this is how our company would survive instead of just quick flipping, which is a lot of hustle and grind.
Yeah.
Not to say that that's wrong for an individual, but this is just how what we're used to and what works for us. But I think I'm out of points to talk about on this. So if we're ready for picks. All right, cool. You went first last week, I believe, right?
Yes, I did. So it's all you.
All right, cool. So again, we're sticking with EDH staples because why not? It's the theme of the day. I'm picking Cage Sun this week, and I'm going for the set version.
Okay.
So Cage Sun to me is actually kind of interesting because I started with this weird bias on the card. I realized as I was taking my notes, and I thought this was like really just for creature decks because of the +1/+1, and I also forgot this was not a symmetrical effect as I was writing this. So you look at the stocks graph and it's kind of loopy, but it always retraces back to its high point, and we're headed back to that now, which is why I wanted to pick this. We're coming out of the doldrums that we saw over the summer. The dip in March of 2020 was the mystery booster release of this card, and so we're finally recovering from that. The absolute best buy-in point would have been like December-ish when I started looking at this card, but I wanted to see a little movement before I really got in. Byleth specific movement. So what I learned was that this card actually plays a lot better in multicolor decks that are just trying to go big. Generally speaking, there's a number of creatureless strategies on here, on Rec, that just need big mana as an artifact, and that makes it a pretty wide open card. You don't really need to worry about the +1/+1 on it because you're playing a white deck or a blue deck or a red deck, which has Mana Flare, but I'll discuss that in a moment. And you don't have access to these mana flares, mana doublers, whatever you want to call them, these colors. And it's doing big things. So, Avacyn, Angel of Hope is here. Phage the Untouchable is here. They cost 8 and 7 respectively. Patron of the Moon, that costs 7. Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur costs 10. These are decks that require a lot of mana to do what they're doing, so they want to get as many, Mono Rocks and doublers in here as possible. So, wide open card, like I said. This is a personal mana doubler through lands only, so it's not like Mana Reflections that actually doubles everything, or Nyxbloom Ancient. And this is a truly colorless artifact. No color CMCs in it. It doesn't attach itself to any particular color because the choice is made upon resolution, and has the ability to help every deck that wants to go big quickly get to their end goal. So this is best played in monocolor decks, as we're seeing, because it really only affects lands that produce mana of the chosen color and affects creatures of the chosen color. You could possibly jam this in a 2-color deck as long as your dominant color represents like the overwhelming majority of your spells. You're probably like 70-75% plus of one color. And as I mentioned, primarily seen outside of red and black by the numbers. I actually ran the numbers on rec for all the generals seen, and it's like 500 white, 500 blue, 200 and change black, back to 500 for red, and somewhere in the 3s for green. And these decks are extremely mana hungry, and the generals and themes that play into the strategy of going big also benefit from the maximum number of mana dollars available, like I mentioned. The bonus that this is, quote-unquote Lord for your creatures is great but unnecessary for most of this stuff. And we do see it come into play for some of the tribal combat-centric decks that are on here, like Avacyn can be attached to Angels. Namada Grove Guardian on here is in here for green, which is going to be like Saplings and Treefolk, and it's useful there but not necessary, so it's gravy. This is the agnostic nature of this card, combined with the utility and personal nature of the mana doubling effect, makes it a good look for any deck with a decently high average CMC. So that's basically what you're going for. It's just the big dumb decks. So as far as the timeline is concerned, so CK buy quantity went up almost 100% in the 4 months that I had this on my list. CK was buying 23 day of. They were buying over 40, or about 40 on Friday when I noted this. But the buy price hasn't really recovered from the last dip. It's still about $5. So we're on track to break past the previous retail high of approximately $10, like I showed on the stocks graph. As we charge into that, I expect the buy price to follow shortly behind it as quantities are moved from the open market. So probably in the next, like I'd say, 2 to 3 weeks is when we'll start finally seeing the buy price go up. Though I checked today, and it does look like part of the outstanding number on CK was actually filled. They're down to buying 25 from almost 40, so 15 over the weekend. But again, quantity is still being removed from the open market. It's taken 4 months to retrace the price, and I expect within the next 3 to 6 months to we'll reach and overtake the previous record high of $10, which means if we were an early adopter, we should be able to sell to buy lists for a profit at the end of the run, which is 6 months, but much earlier if you sell into the open market. So if you buy in now and sell into TCG Player or Facebook in a couple of weeks, you'll be able to make your profit faster. As I did note, the card has been reprinted in Commander 2014, Commander Anthology Volume 2, which was in May 2018, and is in the LGS version of Mystery Boosters that came out in March of 2020, and that accounts for both of the major dips on stocks, and I'll bring this up again. So the dip right after Dominaria and the dip right before Ikoria are where this was reprinted, and you can see it's retraced every time to about $10. So I would expect to see a reprint into Commander product within the next year or two, but that doesn't worry me at all. Cage Stone recovers incredibly well from reprint price depression, which, like Chromatic Lantern, though I do not think this is a card you can ride into the sunset, you need an exit strategy. My personal one would be in that 6-month time period.
I think it's really solid, as you touched on. It's completely agnostic. In fact, most of the people I know that play it in big mana decks, one of which the only creature is the general.
Yep.
So the Lord is an upside. Obviously, in green, you've got a little bit more upside because most of the creatures you're going to lord over are probably mana dorks, whatever. But I think, cards like this also fit into that Timmy mold of what we touched on earlier. It's impactful.
Yep.
It's got a history of being impactful, and it only gets more impactful the more stuff like that they print.
Mm-hmm.
So I think long term, it's incredibly good. I think that, you're probably looking at about a 6 to 8 month reprint. It also has to be reprinted in a supplemental because it is plane specific.
Yes.
Because it is a Cage Sun on Mirrodin, which, God, if we ever go back to Mirrodin again, I think Wizards is just given up.
It's also super clunky in a draft format. Not to say you couldn't do it because Mana Reflections was in Ultimate Masters.
Yeah.
But this is not only a mana doubler effect, it's also a creature.
Yeah, it's an end,
buff,
it
so
tops out your creature curve.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yep. So, like I said, I think our timelines are similar. My personal one, like I said, I'm looking at 6 months, and that's where I would really start to keep an eye on this for buy listing, just because it's not a cyclical nature in terms of reprints. It's not like they do it every 2 years. They waited 4 years between the first Commander reprint, 2014, and the Anthology reprint, and then 2 years from there. I'm not worried about the timing on that overall. I'm worried about the fact that this card doesn't get a lot of eyes, like we mentioned before. You've got to rely on essentially EDH rack to tell you that you need the card, and we have got kind of like peak demand now, or we're going to be heading into it shortly, and that's where I want to be. That's why in 6 months I want to be out to buy list, because the open market should essentially dry, which will lead people to vendors, which means our buy price on it's going to go. So that's where I'm looking.
All right, so mine, and this is kind of an interesting thought experiment. So shout out to Dan for this one, my buddy. We were talking about reserveless stuff about a month and a half ago, looking at stuff that might be targetable, whatever. So I started paying attention to this card. I love this card. I love blowing up all the permanents. My favorite card in Magic is Obliterate. That's not the pick. The pick is Apocalypse from Tempest.
Yep.
It is unique because it's the only red board wipe that deals with enchantments. It is also reserved list. So the interesting thing about this, and if you take a look at the stocks graph, so you see that in February of 21, our average hit $40, which is the all-time high. Mm-hmm. If you look at the low was stagnant at that time and only started increasing recently, whereas the average dropped. So I started paying attention when we were talking about supply on this card. And the interesting thing is that coinciding with this increase of low, we're starting to see more copies listed.
Yep.
Which is interesting because while low is going up, the available quantity is also going up, which means these are selling somewhere. They're not to me. I know that for a fact. I have not bought up all of this card. Dan has not bought all of this card. People I know have not bought up all of this card. I don't know where it's going. The other interesting thing is if you take a look at Card Kingdom still has copies available at near mint below TCG low. So this is an example of when we talked a couple weeks ago about catching market manipulation mid-event.
Yep.
This is a prime example of that. So this is an opportunity for, first off, this is a completely unique effect on the reserve list that is completely unique for the color. So that makes it viable on its own. When you add to the fact that you have something like this market manipulation going on, it's something that you can get in ahead of now. So the other interesting thing is that while the quantity of sellers going up has increased, so has the quantity of sellers selling over 4 on TCG. When we first started looking at this about a month ago, there were 4 sellers with over 4 quantity. There's now 11.
Yep.
This is LP or near mint or above.
Yeah, that's what I got filtered for.
When looking at total listings, last week when I checked, we were at 46 total listings, and the low was 14. We're now at 51 total listings with a low at 1637. When you go to the seller portal side, you can see that they have moved at this number. You can look at eBay and see that they have moved at this number, and yet we have copies available on Card Kingdom for less than TCG low.
Huh.
So something is going on with this card. I don't know what. Someone is definitely behind the scenes messing with it, though, and I think that is very fascinating, and it's merited me. I have bought a couple. I haven't bought large quantity. I'm in it sub 10 copies. But this is something that, when we talked about catching this stuff ahead of the time and being ahead of the curve, just because you're paying attention, this was something that showed up and we were, wait a second, what's going on with this card? There's all these weird things happening. And Card Kingdom's buying it for like $8 right now, and they're only buying like $6, I think. It's not a lot. So I think that timeline-wise, based on what we've seen with Reserve List, we're in kind of a valley for most of the rest of the Reserve List now. This one's actually, gradually ticking up recently. We kind of hit a plateau in like March, and then up a little down, and we've been back and forth a little since, and we're on our way back up on the stocks graph. So I'd be looking at, honestly, Reserveless Fall, just like every other year.
Yep.
If you want to get out at Reserveless Fall, I think you could easily profitably buy list this card for $20 to $25 if you get it now for the 15-16, which making $5 to $10 is not a lot, sure, but that's buy list. I think TCG by that point hits $40. So if you wanted to out on Facebook, you wanted to out to an LGS that pays 70% or whatever, go for it. You can trade it out for profit. It's an interesting thing that I caught, and I immediately grasped onto it because this is something that doesn't happen very often where you catch it mid-event, so to speak. I think that personally, my copies I'm probably going to offload not this fall, which is I think your first exit window about 6 to 8 months from now, but next spring when we hit tax season and stuff starts spiking again.
Got it.
So probably about 12 months for me personally. I think the start of the timeline is about 6 to 8 months though, and you've got a window in there of when it happens. I just think it's something that's going to be fascinating to watch, especially considering there's all these atypical things happening where you have quantity increasing, price increasing. Some vendors have it for less and they just haven't been hit yet, which if you've ever seen staged buyouts, Card Kingdom, Star City, Abu games always get hit first because they want to wipe out the mass market copies before they affect TCG, which is so much easier to manipulate.
Yep.
And that's just not the case here, and it's just fascinating to me to see this happen.
Yeah, no, this is really interesting. A lot of the picks that I've had over the last couple of weeks, we've seen an increase of quantity on TCG Player with a rising market value, and it just seems like because BioList and Card Kingdom have kept up, that it's people essentially outing their copies for profit because now the card is moving. They're able to actually turn that card into cash, and we saw the open market function like the open market, whereas here, there might be some going-ons, behind the scenes. People might be shuffling this card around and just hoarding until the end of time. The numbers on this are pretty interesting when you start looking at the price overall, and it looks like there might be a couple tripwires set in here so that as copies exit the market at a certain price, we're going to see this card actually reload at a much higher price. And I don't mean like the copies that are up here for 250, 400, and a grand. I mean the ones floating in like the 40s through 80s. These might actually just be tripwire copies to let people know, like, hey, TCG has been emptied of reasonable copies. The one that we said is a tripwire finally sold. Let's push the market at a value close to that so we can out our copies at 4, 5, 6, whatever X.
Yeah. So interesting, I thought,
Yep.
And wanted to mention it because I think stuff like this is solid, especially because either one person with incredibly deep pockets or a group of people are doing this.
Nope.
Either way, hey, someone knows something. I'll do it.
Yeah, exactly. And we can get in on this from the outside. Absolutely. And no shame in that at all when you catch something like this. So I think it's great. It's an interesting call out, and if this is something you're fine writing out, you have the time and the money to just kind of set these things aside, by all means, move in.
Also, shout out to Chudwork LLC, who has a copy. Great TCG portal name.
Yep.
Love it.
Yeah, I was looking at this Jank MTG cards. Is also really good. Or JNC
Yeah.
MTG cards. Jank Magic.
Yep.
Great seller name. But
yeah.
I think that's going to be it for this, unless there's anything else you want to touch on.
Nope, we're good.
Right. Then I think that's going to end the cast this week, and we are at MTG Cabalcast on Twitter, Facebook, Patreon, and you can find the audio podcast on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, not SoundCloud, Stitcher, Spotify, Audible, and the video version on YouTube. So for MTG Cabalcast, I am at Halt, I am Reptar on Twitter, and you are
Thirsty Sizzler.
We'll see you next week.